I never thought my son's wedding would be the day I realized how small I'd become in his eyes. They said the ceremony would be private, family only. But when I arrived, his bride looked me up and down and whispered, "Your poverty will embarrass us." They placed me in the back row, behind the flowers, far from the cameras. I wanted to leave, but something in me refused to move. Maybe I needed to see how far my love had fallen. Then he walked in, a man in a dark suit I'd never seen before, confident, calm, like he belonged there. He sat next to me without asking, leaned close and said quietly, "Act like you're mine." My heart stopped. When my son turned and saw us together, the color drained from his face. That was the moment I knew, whatever story they thought they were telling that day, it wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine. They told me to sit in the back, the row for strangers. That's how my husband's funeral started. I arrived early, hoping to find a quiet spot before everyone else came in, but it didn't matter. The moment I stepped inside, people began to turn their heads. It wasn't the kind of attention that comes from sympathy. It was the kind that says, "Why is she here?" They looked me over, then quickly looked away, like seeing me made them uncomfortable. I held a small bouquet of white lilies, the kind Harold used to bring me when he still had good days. They were simple and meant something to us, but in that room, surrounded by expensive flower arrangements and carefully dressed guests, they looked out of place, like me. Claire was standing at the front near the casket when she saw me. She didn't even try to hide the annoyance on her face. Claire is my husband's daughter from his first marriage, 38 years old, always calm, always in control, the kind of woman who never has to ask twice for what she wants. She walked up, straightened her black dress, and pointed toward the front pew. "The family sits there," she said, her voice flat, almost kind. Then she added, "You can sit back there." For a second, I just stood there. I wanted to tell her that I was his wife, that I'd spent the last 2 years caring for him when no one else bothered to call. But I didn't. I just nodded, said thank you, and walked to the back. I'd learned a long time ago that sometimes silence was the only way to survive in a room full of people who'd already decided what you were worth. As I walked past them, I could hear the whispers start. They didn't even bother to lower their voices. "That's her, right? The nurse? She married him right before he died. She doesn't look rich." The words slid through the air like gossip wrapped in perfume. I kept walking, staring at the floor, pretending I didn't hear. I sat in the very last row, my hands shaking a little as I placed the lilies on my lap. From there, everything felt distant. The casket, the people, even Harold himself. The priest started to speak, using words like honor, generosity, legacy. I wondered how many of those people had ever seen him cry, or had to help him out of bed when his body was too weak to move. None of them knew the man I knew. They only knew the one who signed their checks and took them to dinner. As the service went on, I realized how quiet it was in my corner. No one turned to greet me, no one offered a hand or even a nod. The only sound was the tapping of shoes on the marble floor and a few soft sobs from the front. I could tell which ones were real and which ones were for show. I sat there thinking about how strange love becomes when money gets involved. Love makes you family, but money decides who gets to sit in the front. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the bench beside me creak. Someone had sat down. I turned, expecting a late guest, or maybe one of the ushers, but it was neither. He was an older man, maybe my age, dressed in a dark suit. He had silver hair and the kind of calm look you don't see much anymore. He leaned slightly toward me and said quietly, "You shouldn't let them do that." For a second, I thought he was talking to someone else. "Excuse me?" I whispered. "You shouldn't let them treat you like that," he said again. "You were his wife." I stared at him, trying to place his face. There was something familiar about him, though I couldn't figure out what. "They don't see it that way," I said. He nodded slowly, his eyes still on the front of the church. "They never do. Not until someone makes them." Before I could ask him what he meant, everyone stood for the final prayer. He stood too, right beside me, like we'd come together. When Claire turned around and saw us side by side, her face tightened for just a second before she fixed her expression again. But I saw it. When the ceremony ended, everyone rushed to leave. The family went first, of course. People followed in groups, chatting quietly, as if this were a luncheon instead of a funeral. I stayed seated. I didn't want to walk out with them. The man next to me stayed too. After a moment, he spoke again. "He must have meant a lot to you." "He was my husband," I said. "That used to mean something." He nodded, his voice softer now. He was a good man. I knew him years ago. I didn't realize he'd remarried. I smiled a little, not because it was funny, but because I was too tired to explain. Neither did his family, apparently. He looked at me for a long moment, like he wanted to say more but didn't. Then he reached into his pocket and held out a folded handkerchief. "You dropped this," he said. It wasn't mine, but I took it anyway. "Thank you," I told him. He stood and buttoned his jacket. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Miller." Hearing someone call me that again did something to me. It was small, but it mattered. When he left, Claire appeared beside the pew. She didn't sit down. "You didn't have to make a scene," she said quietly. "I didn't," I replied. "I just sat where you told me to." She frowned. "Who was that man?" I shrugged. "Someone who remembers I'm still here." She didn't answer. She just turned and walked out, heels clicking fast on the floor. When the church was empty, I went to the front, placed my lilies on the casket, and whispered goodbye. I told him I was sorry for not fighting harder, though I wasn't sure what for anymore. Outside, the man was waiting near the steps. He gave me a small nod, the kind people give when they understand something you haven't said. I walked up to him. "You didn't have to defend me in there," I said. He smiled faintly. "Old habits? I don't like bullies." "Do I know you?" I asked. "Not yet," he said, "but you used to." Before I could ask anything else, Claire called my name from across the street, impatient as always. I turned for just a second, and when I looked back, he was gone. That night I couldn't sleep. Not because of the funeral, not even because of the way Claire spoke to me. It was because I kept hearing his voice in my head, calm, certain, almost protective. "You shouldn't let them do that." I didn't know it then, but that single sentence was going to change everything that came after. His voice stayed with me all night. I kept hearing it in my head, steady and calm, the way he'd said, "You shouldn't let them do that." I didn't even know his name then, but something about the way he spoke made me feel like I wasn't invisible anymore. The next morning, I told myself it didn't matter. The funeral was over and I should just move on, but I couldn't. I kept replaying his words, his face, the way he looked at me like he already knew me from somewhere. 2 days later, I saw him again. It was at the small coffee shop near the post office, the one where I usually go when I can't stand being home alone. I had just ordered a tea when a familiar voice said, "Mrs. Miller." I turned, and there he was, the man from the funeral. He was wearing the same kind of suit, dark, simple, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made people step aside without realizing why. "Do you mind if I sit?" he asked. I nodded, trying not to stare. "You were at the funeral," I said, as if that wasn't obvious. He smiled gently. "I was. I didn't expect to see you here, though." I looked down at my cup. "I don't think many people do." He waited a moment before speaking again. "Do you remember Camp Delta?" The words hit me like a door slamming open somewhere in my memory. "Camp Delta," I repeated slowly. "Vietnam, 1975? He nodded once. "You were a nurse. Field hospital, small place near the river?" I looked at him carefully, trying to place the younger version of the man sitting in front of me. His face was older now, lines around the eyes, silver hair, but there was something familiar in the way he looked at me. "You were the soldier with the leg wound," I said finally. "You came in with shrapnel near your artery. You were half conscious, kept asking if your men made it out." He smiled faintly. "You remembered?" "How could I not?" I said quietly. "You almost died on that table." He leaned back a little. "You saved me. I never forgot that." For a while, neither of us spoke. The sound of cups, chairs, and soft conversation filled the space around us, but I barely heard it. I just kept looking at him, trying to bridge the gap between the girl I was back then and the woman sitting here now. Finally, I asked, "Why were you at Harold's funeral?" He looked down at his hands. "He was my attorney for a few years, back when I was still running Cross Industries. We worked together on some veterans projects. When I heard he passed, I came to pay my respects." "That's unexpected," I said. "He never mentioned you." "He wouldn't have," Daniel said simply. "Your husband liked to keep things tidy, but when I saw how they treated you that day, I couldn't just sit there." "Daniel?" I repeated his name slowly, testing it against the memory. "Daniel Cross." He nodded. "That's right." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The years between us felt both enormous and small at the same time. Here we were, two people who had met once in chaos, now meeting again in silence. After a pause, I said, "You look good. Healthier than the last time I saw you." He laughed softly. "I've had 50 years to recover." Then, quieter, "You still have the same eyes." The comment caught me off guard. I wasn't used to being seen anymore, not like that. Not by someone who wasn't judging, calculating, or pitying me. Before I could respond, the door opened and Claire walked in. She spotted me immediately and froze when she saw Daniel sitting across from me. Her expression tightened. She walked straight to the table, her heels hitting the floor in sharp clicks. "Grace," she said coolly, "I didn't realize you were entertaining company." "I'm having tea," I said evenly. "Not a press conference?" Her eyes shifted to Daniel. "And you are?" He stood, polite but firm. "Daniel Cross. I was an old friend of Harold's." Claire gave him a thin smile, the kind that hides suspicion behind manners. "Of course. Well, I just wanted to remind you, Grace, that we'll be handling the will privately. No need to come by the office." I blinked. "Privately? I'm his wife." "The arrangements are complicated," she said quickly. "You'll be informed of the outcome." Daniel's face didn't change, but I could see the sharpness behind his calm eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small business card. "Mrs. Miller," he said, handing it to me, "if they try to bury you too, call me." Claire frowned. "Excuse me?" Daniel smiled politely. "I'm just offering support. Harold was a friend. I'm sure he'd want his wife treated fairly." Claire's jaw tightened again. "That won't be necessary." She turned to me. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." When she left, Daniel sat back down. "She reminds me of every lawyer I ever fired," he said dryly. I looked at the card in my hand. It was simple. Daniel Cross, veteran and consultant. No company name, no address, just a phone number written in clean black ink. "Why would you help me?" I asked. "You don't even know what's going on." He looked at me steady and direct. "I know what I saw, and I know what it feels like to be pushed out of your own life. That's enough for me." For a moment I couldn't speak. There was something about the way he said it. Not pity, not charity, just truth. He finished his coffee and stood up. "Take care of yourself, Grace, and don't let them take what's yours." When he left, I sat there for a long time, staring at the business card. It had been years since anyone had stood up for me. Harold had, in his quiet way, but no one else. I didn't know if Daniel meant it or if it was just something people say when they want to sound kind, but the way he looked at me, calm and certain, made me believe that maybe, for the first time in a long time, I had someone in my corner again. That night, I put the card on my kitchen table right beside the folded lilies I'd brought home from the funeral. I didn't call him. Not yet. But I looked at that number for a long time, knowing deep down that someday soon I probably would. After everyone left, I stayed in the church. The air felt different once the crowd was gone, quieter but heavier somehow. I could still smell the flowers, that mix of roses and lilies that always reminded me of hospitals. A few petals had fallen near the aisle, and for reasons I can't explain, I bent down and picked them up. Maybe I just needed something to do with my hands. Someone had knocked over a vase near the back pew. I found a cloth in the corner and started wiping up the spilled water. It wasn't my job, but no one else was going to do it. Cleaning up after people was something I was used to. Maybe that's what I'd been doing my whole life, fixing what others left behind. When I finally sat down again, the church was completely empty. The sound of my own breathing echoed off the walls. I looked at the flowers near the casket, now slightly wilted. I thought about Harold. Not the man everyone in that room praised, but the man I knew at home, the one who used to struggle to tie his own shoes when his hands shook too much. The memories came without warning, one after another. The hospital room, the smell of medicine and old sheets, the sound of his labored breathing at 2 a.m. I used to sit beside him reading aloud even when he wasn't awake enough to listen. Sometimes, when the pain was bad, he'd just squeeze my hand until it passed. Those moments didn't make it into the priest's speech. No one ever tells the part of the story that happens behind closed doors. I remember the night he asked me to marry him. It was during one of his better days. The treatment had made him weak, but his mind was still sharp. He was sitting in his favorite chair watching the rain hit the window. I had just brought him tea when he reached for my hand. "Marry me, Grace," he said. His voice was quiet but sure. I laughed then because it didn't make sense. "Harold, you don't have to say things like that just because you're scared." He shook his head. "It's not about dying," he said. "It's because you're the only person who makes me feel alive." That was the first time in years I saw his eyes light up. Really light up. I said yes that night. Not because I needed to be his wife, but because he needed someone to remind him that he was still here. We had 6 months together after that. 6 months of appointments, of laughter in between doctor visits, of me trying to make him eat when he didn't want to, of him pretending to read just to keep me from worrying. Those months were harder than anything I've ever lived through, but I'd do them all over again. The sound of the church bell snapped me out of the memory. It rang sharp and distant, like something trying to wake me up. I blinked, realizing I was still holding the same petals I'd picked up earlier. They'd started to crumble in my hand. I walked toward the front again, stopping by the pew where Daniel had sat. The space looked ordinary now, just another seat in a long row, but I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me, like he knew something I didn't. His words from earlier replayed in my head. "If they try to bury you too, call me." I took the business card out of my pocket and looked at it again. Daniel Cross. The name sounded familiar now that I had time to think. Maybe from the news, or maybe from years ago when Harold mentioned a veterans project. It was strange how lives overlapped, how someone from your past could appear just when you thought your story was over. For a moment I thought about calling him. I even reached for my phone, but then I stopped. I didn't know what I'd say. I wasn't ready to talk about lawyers or wills or family fights. Not yet. So instead, I folded the card carefully and slipped it back into my pocket. Maybe later, I thought. Maybe when I'm stronger. The sun had started to set outside, and the light coming through the stained glass looked softer now. Less like judgment and more like forgiveness. I stood for a long time, just looking at Harold's name on the memorial program I still held. His handwriting was on the back, the little note he'd written the day before he went into the hospital. "Stop worrying, Grace. You always make things better." I smiled, even though it hurt. I wanted to believe he was right. When I finally stepped outside, the street was empty. The cars were gone, the crowd had moved on, and I was the only one left. The wind had picked up, carrying bits of flower petals down the sidewalk. I stood there watching them scatter until I couldn't tell which ones were mine. I turned back toward the church one last time. From the outside, it looked peaceful, solid, steady, like nothing inside had ever fallen apart. But I knew better. I started walking, slowly, down the empty street. For a moment, I could still hear the echo of the bell fading behind me, and then silence. That's how it felt, like the world had gone quiet and I was standing in the middle of it, waiting for something I couldn't name. Maybe a sign, maybe courage, maybe just someone to remind me I still mattered. I reached into my pocket and touched the card again, feeling the edge press against my fingers. I didn't take it out this time. I just kept walking, one step at a time, the sound of my shoes the only proof I was still moving forward. If someone had been watching from afar, and maybe someone was, they would have seen a woman walking alone down a long, empty street, carrying a folded piece of paper in her pocket and the weight of 100 unsaid things in her chest. That's what loss really looks like. Not crying, not shouting, just the quiet sound of being left behind. I only meant to sit and listen. I didn't go there to fight or prove anything. I thought it would be simple. A few papers, some signatures, and a quiet end to everything Harold left behind. But they made me the center of the storm instead. The lawyer's office was smaller than I expected. It smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. There were 4 chairs lined up in front of a heavy wooden desk, and one of them was already taken by Claire. She sat with her husband, both of them dressed like they were going to court. Her face had that polite calm she used when she was about to be cruel. "Grace," she said without looking up from her phone, "you didn't have to come. These things can be complicated." "I'm aware," I said. "He was my husband." Her husband cleared his throat. "Well, technically you were married only 7 months. "Technically," I said quietly, "I was there every day for 2 years before that." They didn't answer. I sat down at the far end of the table, close enough to hear but far enough to remind them I wasn't asking for permission to exist. The lawyer, a man named Harris, walked in with a folder under his arm. He looked like he'd been doing this job too long, the kind of man who could read a will without showing a single emotion. He adjusted his glasses and said, "All right, shall we begin?" Claire nodded, all business. I just folded my hands in my lap and tried to breathe. Harris opened the folder and began reading. His voice was steady, the words formal, almost cold. "This is the last will and testament of Mr. Harold Lawson, Signed and witnessed on April 12th of last year. I stared at the date. That was 2 weeks after Harold's last hospital stay. I remembered him sitting up in bed, insisting on writing something down, even though his hands shook. I thought it was just another list of instructions for the nurses. Harris continued. To his daughter, Claire Lawson, he leaves the property in Aspen and all personal items belonging to the Lawson estate prior to 2019. To his wife, Mrs. Grace Miller, he leaves 60% of his financial holdings, including all remaining shares in Lawson Industries and joint investments. The room went silent. For a few seconds, no one said anything. The air itself seemed to thicken. Then I heard the sound of a pen falling onto the table, sharp, quick. Claire's voice broke the silence. What did you just say? Harris repeated the line, his tone unchanged. 60% to his lawful wife, Mrs. Grace Miller. She laughed, but it wasn't really laughter. It was the kind of sound people make when they're trying not to scream. He was dying. She manipulated him when he was barely conscious. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't say a word. Harris kept his eyes on the document. The will was witnessed and verified. All procedures were followed. By who? Claire snapped. Who would even sign off on something like that? Harris glanced up. Mr. Daniel Cross, CEO of Cross Healthcare. The name hit me before the door opened, but when it did, it felt like the world shifted. Daniel walked in quietly, just as composed as he'd been at the funeral. He nodded once at me, then at Harris. The light from the hallway caught his hair, silver against the dark suit. Claire stood. You're involved in this? Daniel didn't flinch. I was present when Harold signed. He asked me to be there as a witness. You're lying, Claire said. You're just trying to help her. Daniel's voice stayed calm. I have no reason to lie. Harold asked me to come that day. He wanted someone he trusted, someone not tied to the family. I could feel Claire's anger from across the table. Her husband whispered something to her, but she waved him off. He didn't even know you, she said sharply. Daniel looked at her, unbothered. He knew me well enough to trust my word. Harris cleared his throat. All signatures have been verified through our office. Everything is legally binding. Claire turned to me then, her face red now. You must feel proud. You got what you wanted. I met her eyes. I wanted him to live. The money was his decision. That's convenient, she said. You take care of him, marry him when he's dying, and suddenly you're the heiress. Her husband put a hand on her arm, whispering, Claire, enough. But she pulled away. No, I want to hear it. Tell me, Grace, did you love him? Or just his name? Something inside me cracked, not loud, not visible, just deep enough to sting. I could have yelled. I could have thrown the card from Daniel's pocket in her face and told her that her father made me promise to forgive her. But I didn't. I just said, you wouldn't understand what it's like to take care of someone who's dying. That shut her up. For a second, at least. Harris continued reading the final paragraphs, but I barely heard him. My ears were ringing, and my heart felt like it was beating in the wrong rhythm. I watched Daniel instead. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his presence kept me steady, like he was quietly holding the line for me. When Harris closed the folder, he said, That concludes the reading. Copies will be sent to all parties. Claire stood up so fast that her chair scraped against the floor. We'll contest this, she said. My father wasn't in his right mind. This isn't over. Daniel looked at her calmly. You can contest it all you want. The recording of that day is still in the lawyer's archive. She froze. Recording? Harris nodded. Mr. Lawson insisted on video documentation for transparency, standard practice in cases like this. Claire's face went pale. She looked at me one last time, pure anger and disbelief, then stormed out with her husband trailing behind her. When the door closed, it was quiet again. I finally exhaled. Daniel looked at me and said softly, You did nothing wrong, Grace. I didn't expect this, I said. I thought she'd get everything. Harold wanted you taken care of, he said. He told me himself. I nodded slowly, still trying to catch up with what just happened. Why did he ask you to be the witness? Daniel paused, choosing his words. He said he trusted you more than his family, and he trusted me to make sure that trust wasn't wasted. I looked down at my hands, still trembling slightly. That sounds like him. Daniel handed me a small envelope. He left this for you, separately. I took it, but didn't open it yet. I was afraid of what I might find. His handwriting, his words, something final. When Daniel left, I stayed behind for a while, staring at the empty chairs. I had walked into that office expecting to disappear quietly, but instead, I had become the center of everything they hated. And for the first time, I started to realize that maybe Harold's death wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. When they can't take your money, they'll try to take your dignity. That's what I learned in the weeks after the will was read. It started slowly, a headline here, a whisper there. Then one morning, I walked into the corner store and saw my own face on the front page of a magazine. Nurse Mary's dying tycoon inherits millions. Underneath was a picture of me from the funeral, taken without my knowing. My eyes were down, my hands folded. They made me look like a thief who had just been caught. By afternoon, it was everywhere. On the local news, online, even on the radio. They used my story like entertainment. The nurse who got rich, they called me. Not the wife, not the caregiver, just the nurse. The cashier at the store tried not to look at me, but I could feel it. People who'd known me for years suddenly had something in their eyes. Curiosity, judgment, maybe even disgust. It's strange how fast people change sides when money's involved. At the diner, 2 women sitting behind me whispered loud enough for me to hear. She must have planned it. Of course, they always do. I didn't say a word. I paid for my coffee and left, but the shame followed me out the door like a shadow. That night, my son Michael called. His voice was quiet. "Mom, I saw the news." "I know," I said. "Boy, don't believe everything you read." There was a long pause. "Did you really get all that money?" "I got what he left me," I said simply. "That's all?" Another silence. Then he said, "People are talking." "Let them," I told him. "They talked before. They'll talk again." But when we hung up, I sat there at the kitchen table staring at my phone, wondering if I had just lost my son, too. The next morning, an envelope came under my door. No return address. Inside was a piece of paper with one line written in red ink. "You don't deserve his name." I don't know what hurt more, the words or the fact that someone took the time to write them by hand. A few days later, Claire went public. She filed a lawsuit claiming the will was fraudulent. Reporters started showing up near my house, shouting questions whenever I stepped outside. "Did you marry him for the money? Did you manipulate him while he was sick? Are you planning to settle?" I stopped answering the door. I started leaving the lights off at night so people would think I wasn't home. It felt like the whole world had decided who I was, and no one had even asked me. One afternoon, I was sitting by the window when I saw a familiar car pull up. Daniel stepped out, holding a folder under his arm. He knocked once, waited, then knocked again. I thought about pretending I wasn't there, but something made me open the door. He looked at me and said, "You're hiding." "I'm tired," I said. "They've made me into something I'm not." He nodded. "That's how they win. They wear you down until you start believing their version of you." I stepped aside to let him in. He looked around, noticed the stack of newspapers on the counter, all with my face on them. He walked over and turned the top one upside down. "You don't need to look at that," he said. "They don't deserve your attention." I didn't ask for any of this, I told him. I didn't want the money. I didn't want the house. I just wanted peace. But now I'm the villain in a story I didn't write. He sat down across from me, his expression calm but firm. "You stood by him when everyone else left. That's not manipulation, Grace. That's loyalty." I shook my head. "Loyalty doesn't sell papers." "Then let me help you," he said. "Let me handle the legal side. You shouldn't face this alone." I looked at him carefully. "Why are you doing this? You barely know me." He leaned forward. "Because I owe you more than you know. You saved my life once. Maybe it's time I return the favor." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I didn't want to admit it, but hearing those words, "You shouldn't face this alone," made something inside me loosen. For weeks, I'd been drowning in silence, and suddenly someone had thrown me a rope. Finally, I said, "All right, but I don't want to fight her. I just want her to stop." He nodded. "Sometimes the only way to make them stop is to fight back." He opened his folder and spread out a few papers on the table. Legal documents, letters from the firm, copies of the will. "They're trying to discredit you," he said. "They've already reached out to the media with a new angle, that you convinced him to change the will under medication. We'll need to respond before that sticks." I stared at the papers. I can't go through another public fight. He met my eyes. Then we'll make it private. But we'll do it right. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Fear, because I knew things were about to get worse before they got better. Relief, because at least now I wasn't the only one standing in the storm. When he left, I walked over to the window again. The reporters were still there, waiting with their cameras, hoping for a reaction. I pulled the curtain closed. They said I stole him, I whispered to myself, but no one asked what I lost. I turned off the light and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the sound of the rain hitting the roof. Outside, the world was still talking, still twisting everything into a story that fit their version of truth. But inside, for the first time, I felt a little less alone. In 1975, I saved a soldier who didn't have a name. 40 years later, that soldier came back and saved me. That's what I kept thinking as I sat across from Daniel again. He'd come by after another long day of chaos. Reporters, letters, phone calls. I was tired, and he could see it. He didn't start with questions or papers this time. He just sat down, waited, and said, "You still haven't called your lawyer." "I don't know what to say," I admitted. "I don't want to fight anymore." He leaned forward. "Grace, this isn't about fighting. It's about not letting them rewrite who you are." I looked at him, at his calm face, at the lines that time had drawn since I first met him at that field hospital decades ago. I hadn't thought about that place in years. I'd buried those memories so deep they almost felt like someone else's story. But sitting there with him, it all came back. I was 24, stationed in Vietnam, assigned to a makeshift hospital near the river. It was hot, the kind of heat that made the air taste like metal. We worked 12-hour shifts that turned into 20. Every sound outside meant more bodies coming in. One night, they brought him in. The young soldier with a shrapnel wound in his leg, barely conscious, blood everywhere. They said he'd been out there for hours before someone found him. I remember his face, pale, dirt-streaked, eyes open but unfocused. "Hold still," I told him. He tried to speak but couldn't. I was pressing down on the wound, doing everything I could to stop the bleeding. He reached for my wrist, weakly, and whispered something I couldn't hear. I leaned closer. "If I live," he said slowly, "I'll find you again." It was the kind of thing soldiers said when they were halfway between life and death. I didn't think he meant it, but I never forgot it. I didn't even know his name back then, just another boy we patched up and sent away. Now, all these years later, that same man was sitting across from me, watching me struggle to believe in myself again. "I think about him sometimes," I said quietly, not looking up. "Who?" he asked. "The soldier," I said. "The one from Camp Delta. He told me he'd find me again." He smiled a little. "Maybe he did." That's when I realized he wasn't just helping me out of kindness. He was that soldier. Older now, stronger, but still with the same eyes I remembered from that night. "You remember?" I said softly. "Of course I do," he replied. "You saved my life, Grace. I never forgot that." I felt a mix of surprise and something deeper, something that made the years between us disappear for a moment. "All this time," I said, "you never reached out." "I didn't know how," he said. "And then when I finally found you again, it was at a funeral. Not exactly how I imagined it." We sat in silence for a while. Then Daniel reached into his briefcase and took out a file. He opened it and slid a document across the table. It was Harold's will, the official copy. On the last page, Harold's signature stood beside his fingerprint, clear and deliberate. Daniel tapped the page. "He trusted you, Grace. Don't let them twist his death into shame." I stared at it for a long time. That fingerprint, that was him. That was the man who held my hand in hospital corridors, who asked me to marry him not because he was dying, but because he still wanted to live. I thought about all the lies being told now, all the people calling me a fraud, a thief, a woman who married for money, and I thought about Harold, about how he'd looked at me the day before he passed and said, "Don't let them take your kindness and turn it into weakness." Daniel watched me quietly. "You have to decide," he said. "Are you going to let them take what's left of his truth, or are you going to fight for it?" I didn't answer right away. I got up, walked to the window, and looked outside. The reporters were gone for the night, but their vans were still parked nearby, waiting for something new to feed on. The world had already chosen its story. I could feel it pressing down on me. But something in me had started to shift. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was the memory of that young soldier looking up at me, bleeding, promising to live. Maybe it was Harold's trust, now resting in my hands like a challenge. I turned back to Daniel. "If we do this," I said, "I don't want pity. I want the truth." "That's exactly what I want too," he said. He pushed the folder toward me again, along with a small card with a lawyer's number on it. "Call her," he said. "She'll handle the filings. I'll take care of the rest." I hesitated. For weeks, I'd avoided making that call. Every time I picked up the phone, fear stopped me. Fear of being judged, of being dragged deeper into the mess, of losing what little peace I had left. But now, the fear felt smaller than the anger building beneath it. I took a deep breath, picked up the phone, and dialed the number. My hands were shaking, but I didn't stop. When the line rang, I met Daniel's eyes. "I'm ready," I said. He smiled, the kind of smile that carries both pride and relief. When the call connected, I straightened my back and said, "This is Grace Miller. I'd like to talk about my husband's will." For the first time since Harold's funeral, my voice didn't shake. Outside, a light from one of the reporters' vans reflected off the window, catching my face in the glass. I didn't look away. For once, I didn't care how the world saw me, because in that moment, I wasn't just a widow or a nurse or the woman people whispered about. I was someone finally ready to fight back. I stood in front of them, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a widow. I wasn't there to mourn anymore. I was there to testify, not about money, not about property, but about loyalty. The courtroom was cold, too bright, too clean. The kind of place where truth gets dressed up in rules and paperwork. Reporters filled the benches in the back. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but I could still feel them waiting outside the doors like vultures. Claire sat across the room, wearing black again. I wondered if it was grief or strategy. Her lawyer whispered something to her, and she nodded without looking at me. Daniel sat behind my table, calm as always, a quiet anchor in a storm I hadn't wanted but could no longer avoid. The judge entered. Everyone stood. I tried to steady my hands, but they still trembled slightly. The case was listed as Lawson versus Miller, though the fight was never really about law. It was about pride, inheritance, and what people think a woman like me deserves. Claire's lawyer started first. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, almost kind, the way people sound right before they twist the knife. "My client believes the late Mr. Lawson was not in full capacity when the will was signed," he said. "There is evidence to suggest that Mrs. Grace Miller, then his nurse, administered medication that impaired his judgment. We believe the will was obtained through manipulation." The words hit me like cold water. Then Claire stood up, unable to wait her turn. "She drugged my father," she said, pointing at me. "She made him sign things he didn't even understand." The judge gave her a warning look, but she didn't stop. He was sick. He didn't know what he was doing. She saw her chance and took it. Her voice cracked on the last sentence. For a moment I saw it, the raw pain behind all that anger. She wasn't just furious, she was broken. But pain doesn't give you the right to destroy someone else. My lawyer stood and pressed a button on the small remote she'd brought. The screen on the far wall flickered to life. "I'd like to present Exhibit C," she said, "a recording made by Mr. Harold Lawson 2 days before his death." The room went quiet. Then his voice filled the air. Hoarse, weak, but steady. "Grace was the only person who stayed," Harold said. "When I was sick, when the money ran out, she didn't leave. The rest did. When the bills got too high, the visits stopped. But she stayed. If anyone questions my choices, let this be my answer. She earned everything I have to give." No one moved. No one even breathed. The only sound was the faint hum of the speaker. Claire froze. Her face went pale. She looked around like she was trying to find something to hold on to, some version of reality where her father hadn't just undone every accusation she'd made. Her husband put a hand on her shoulder, but she shook it off. The judge leaned forward. "Do you contest the authenticity of this recording, Ms. Lawson?" Claire's lawyer hesitated. "Your Honor, we—" Before he could finish, Daniel stood up. "If I may," he said. The judge nodded. Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "I was there the day that will was signed. I was the witness. Mr. Lawson was alert. He spoke clearly. He read every line before he signed. No medication was given that morning. I saw the truth with my own eyes." Claire looked up at him with disbelief. "You're lying for her." Daniel didn't even blink. No, Miss Lawson. I'm telling the truth for him. The judge took a moment, then spoke. I have reviewed the documents, the medical records, and now this recording. The will is valid. The court finds no evidence of coercion or manipulation. Case dismissed. The words echoed through the room, final and heavy. Claire's lawyer closed his folder quietly, but Claire didn't move. Then, suddenly, she stood up, her voice rising. This isn't over. You stole him from me. You turned him against his own family. The bailiff took a step forward, but I shook my head. I looked at her, not as an enemy, but as a daughter who had lost something she couldn't understand. Grief doesn't give you the right to hate, I said softly. She froze. For a second, the anger in her eyes flickered, replaced by something that looked almost like confusion, or maybe shame. Then she turned and walked out, her heels echoing against the floor until the sound faded. The judge left. The reporters rushed the hallway. My lawyer packed up her files. Daniel stayed where he was, watching me. When I finally stood, the room was empty except for us. I walked toward the window near the back, where the morning light came through the blinds. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel rich. I just felt done. I turned to Daniel, ready to thank him, but he was already watching me with that quiet, knowing look. You okay? He asked. I nodded, though my throat was tight. I think so. He smiled. Then it's over. I nodded again, but as I looked out through the window, one tear slipped down my cheek before I could stop it. Just one. The kind that carries everything. Anger, relief, exhaustion, love. I let it fall. And for the first time in months, I let myself breathe again. They say no one can make you small, unless you bow your head and let them. That thought stayed with me in the days after the hearing. For the first time in months, the phone stopped ringing every hour. The reporters didn't camp outside the gate anymore. The silence felt strange, like a wound finally closing. But peace doesn't last long when people smell a story. By the weekend, the headlines were back. Only this time, they sounded different. Widow wins, but chooses silence. The nurse who never spoke back. The same news anchors who once called me a manipulator now used words like dignified and graceful. They spoke my name like it meant something again. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like irony. I didn't answer interviews. I didn't write statements. I just kept quiet. Then, one morning, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a magazine, the education section of the Denver Chronicle. The article was titled, The Woman Who Stayed. The byline stopped me cold. Written by Emily Tran, former student of Grace Miller. I sat down and read every word. She didn't marry for money, Emily wrote. She stayed for love. I was one of her students 25 years ago. She taught me what compassion looks like, the quiet kind that doesn't need applause. When the world turned against her, she didn't shout, didn't defend. She simply stood her ground. That's the kind of strength money can't buy. By the time I finished reading, I realized I was crying. Not because the world had changed its mind, but because someone had remembered who I really was. Within hours, the article spread online. Strangers wrote messages apologizing for judging me too fast. Some shared their own stories about being misjudged or silenced. The same internet that once tore me apart was now stitching me back together. One message stood out. It said, "You reminded me to hold my head high, no matter what they say." I read that line 3 times before saving it. Maybe that was the only apology I ever really needed. Daniel called later that afternoon. "You should see what's happening online," he said, almost amused. "I try not to look," I told him. "Well, then let me summarize. You've become a symbol of integrity. And before you ask, no, I didn't plan that." I smiled. "Good, because I'm tired of plans." He laughed. "One more thing. There's going to be a press conference tomorrow. I'd like you to come." "Why?" "You'll see." The next day, the small conference room at Cross Healthcare was packed. Cameras, microphones, reporters, all waiting. I hadn't planned to speak, just to stand beside Daniel as he made the announcement. He stepped up to the podium and said, "After careful thought and discussion, Grace Miller has chosen to dedicate her inheritance to create the Herald Foundation. Its purpose will be to support families caring for terminally ill loved ones, the people who do the hard work quietly, without help, just like Grace once did." The room fell silent. Then came the sound of cameras clicking, that soft, endless flutter that always feels both invasive and unreal. A reporter asked, "Mrs. Miller, do you have anything to add?" I looked at Daniel. He gave a small nod. I stepped forward, not to defend myself, not to justify, but to finish something that had started long ago. People think money changes who you are, I said, but it only shows what's already there. Harold trusted me because he saw something good in me, something I almost forgot I had. If this money can do some good now, then that's what it's for. Maybe that's how he'd want to be remembered. Another question came from the back. What about Claire Lawson? How do you feel about her now? I took a moment. Cameras leaned in. Maybe now, I said quietly, she'll learn what love feels like when it's not bought. There were no gasps, no applause, just silence, the kind that carries weight. Afterward, when the conference ended, I stepped outside into the afternoon light. The air felt softer. For the first time in months, no one shouted my name or pointed their phone at me. Daniel walked beside me. You did well, he said. I just told the truth, I replied. He smiled. That's what people needed to hear. We stood there for a while, watching the cars pass, neither of us saying much. The city moved on, as it always does. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the sky fade into evening. The world felt quiet again. Not empty, just quiet. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like exile. It felt like freedom. He reached out his hand, not to save me, but to invite me to live again. It happened a few weeks after the press conference. The noise had faded. The reporters had found new stories to chase, and the city had moved on. For once, my life felt still. I could hear myself think again. I was sitting in the small cafe down the street, the one where Harold and I used to go for breakfast on Sundays. Same table by the window, same chipped sugar jar, different silence. That's when Daniel walked in. He didn't call first. He never did. He just appeared like someone who'd always belonged in the story, whether I'd invited him or not. Still drinking the same tea, he said, smiling as he sat across from me. Still showing up without warning, I replied. He laughed. Consistency matters. For a few minutes, we just sat there, comfortable in the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folder. I sighed. More papers? Less than usual, he said, and more interesting. He opened it to a single page, a letterhead that read Herald Foundation, European Initiative. Beneath it, the proposal for a charity center in Venice, Italy. I blinked. Venice? He nodded. There's a hospital there that's been struggling. They need a new wing for palliative care. I want the foundation to fund it. I want you to help run it. I stared at him. Me? Yes, you. You have the experience, the heart, and frankly, the credibility the board doesn't have. Daniel, I started, but he raised a hand. I'm not asking you to be a figurehead. I'm asking you to lead. You've spent your whole life taking care of other people. Maybe it's time to do it again, but on your own terms. I looked down at the papers. The thought of Italy, of sunlight and canals and unfamiliar faces, sounded beautiful and terrifying all at once. People will say I'm chasing money again, I said quietly. He smiled, that soft, patient smile of his. Then let's make them talk about something true for once. I laughed despite myself. You always have an answer, don't you? Not always, he said. Just when it matters. He slid the folder across the table. I didn't open it. I just stared at it, like it might burn if I touched it. I don't know if I can start over, I said. I'm 68, Daniel. You're breathing, aren't you? He said. That's all the starting over you need. Something in his voice made me look up. There it was again, that same steady look I'd seen in the hospital decades ago when he was just a young soldier clinging to life. Back then, I had saved him because I couldn't stand to watch another person die. Now, he was giving that same gift back to me, a reason to live. We spent the next hour going through the logistics, transfer of funds, documents for the board, plans for the center. He spoke like a man who'd already made peace with the future. I listened like someone afraid to believe it was real. At one point, he said, You don't have to decide today. Just promise me you'll think about it. I will, I said, though even as I said it, I knew I'd already decided. The next morning, I found myself sitting at my desk, looking at Harold's old pen, the one he used to sign the foundation papers. It still worked. I picked it up and wrote my name next to Daniel's on the transfer document. The ink spread a little, but the line was firm. I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel young again. I just felt ready. Later that day, Daniel came by with a stack of finalized papers. "So," he said, "does this mean I should start looking for tickets?" "You're relentless," I said, but I was smiling. "Someone has to be," he said. We signed the final documents together that afternoon. It wasn't glamorous, just a few signatures, a few handshakes, and quiet relief. When it was done, he looked at me and said softly, "You know, I think Harold would have liked this. The idea of turning pain into something good." I nodded. He always believed in that. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us looking at the papers that would send us halfway across the world. Then Daniel reached across the table, his palm open, steady. "Come with me," he said. "Not because you have to, because you still can." I took his hand, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was running from anything. I was walking toward something new. That night, as I packed my things, I found the old photo from Camp Delta, me and a group of nurses smiling in the dust and heat. Daniel was there too, young, thin, squinting into the sun. I traced the corner of the picture with my thumb and smiled. We'd both made it out, barely, and somehow, 50 years later, we were still finding ways to save each other. When the last bag was zipped, I turned off the lights and walked out. The camera of life, if there was one, would have followed me to the table by the window where the folder still lay open, a map of Venice visible beneath it. Soft golden light poured through the blinds, landing on the word foundation. And for once, it didn't look like an ending. It looked like a beginning. I didn't come to say goodbye. I came to say thank you. The cemetery was quiet that morning, not the kind of quiet that feels empty, but the kind that holds something sacred. The air was cool, the sky pale. I walked slowly, one hand holding a small bouquet of white lilies. Harold never liked roses. He said they were too proud for their own beauty. When I reached his headstone, I knelt and brushed a few fallen leaves away. The name still looked too new, carved too neatly for a man who had lived such a complicated life. I placed the flowers down and sat there for a while, not saying anything at first. "You'd hate all this attention," I finally said. "The news, the headlines, the noise. You just wanted peace, and somehow I made a storm." I smiled a little, even though it stung. "But I hope you'd still be proud. The foundation's real now. Your name's on it. People are already calling. Families who need help, who don't know where to go, they'll have somewhere to turn. We did that, Harold. You and me." The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of grass and rain. I closed my eyes and let it pass through me. "You taught me love didn't have to shout," I whispered. "You taught me it could be quiet, steady, the kind that stays when everything else leaves. I spent so long trying to prove I was worthy of it. Maybe now I can just live it." I reached out and pressed my hand against the cool stone. "You taught me love could be quiet. I'll spend the rest of mine proving it loud." When I stood up, I saw someone walking toward me from the path. Tall, familiar, moving carefully over the wet ground. It was Michael. He looked older than I remembered, maybe because I hadn't seen him since the trial. He stopped a few feet away, holding a small paper bag in one hand. Inside were wildflowers, messy but beautiful, like something he'd picked himself. "I didn't think you'd come," I said softly. He nodded. "I didn't think I could." We stood there for a long time, the silence between us heavier than words but softer than before. He finally spoke. "Mom, I'm sorry." I turned toward him. "For what?" "For doubting you," he said. "For believing what they said. I should have known better." I looked at him. My son, my only child, the one who'd stayed silent when I needed him most. But now his voice was shaking, and I saw the boy he used to be hiding behind the man he'd become. "I understand," I said. "People say things loud enough, and it's hard not to believe them." He shook his head. "I should have called. I should have stood by you." I reached out and took his hand. "Then just don't repeat their silence." He looked down at our hands, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't pull away. We stayed like that. Two people who had both lost something, but somehow found a piece of it again in each other. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quiet. "Daniel told me you're leaving soon." I nodded. "Next week, Venice." He smiled faintly. "Dad would have liked that. He always wanted to see Italy." "Then I'll see it for him," I said. We both looked at the grave again. The lilies were already moving in the wind, bending but not breaking. Michael placed his flowers next to mine. He'd be proud of you, Mom. I hope so, I said. When he left, I stayed a little longer. The sky had started to change. Soft gold, filtering through gray, the kind of light that feels like forgiveness. I took one last look at Harold's name, whispered a final thank you, and turned toward the gate. As I walked down the path, I felt lighter, not because the pain was gone, but because it finally had somewhere to go. At the end of the path, Daniel was waiting by the car. He didn't say anything, just opened the door and smiled. I smiled back. Let's go. He nodded. Venice? Venice, I said. As we drove away, the cemetery faded in the mirror, smaller, quieter, but not forgotten. And for the first time since all of this began, I didn't look back. 67 years old, and for the first time in my life, I didn't need anyone's permission to be happy. The airport was busy that morning, a steady rhythm of movement and voices. Families said goodbye, business travelers scrolled through their phones, children clung to their parents' hands. I stood near the gate, holding my passport and a small carry-on, watching the planes lift off one by one. I'd spent most of my life in places where I was either waiting for someone or being left behind, but this time was different. This time, I was the one leaving. Not to escape, but to begin again. Daniel was waiting near the window, 2 tickets in his hand. He waved when he saw me, that same calm, unhurried smile that had steadied me through every storm. You made it, he said. I almost didn't, I admitted. Had to talk myself out of turning around twice on the way here. He chuckled. You've had enough turning around for one lifetime. We walked toward the check-in counter together. I could feel people looking, not because they knew who I was, but because they saw something they didn't expect. An old woman holding her head high, walking beside a man who still believed in second chances. The light poured through the tall glass windows, the kind that makes everything look softer. Somewhere, a loudspeaker called out our flight number. Venice, boarding in 20 minutes. Daniel handed me my ticket. Business class, he said, half teasing. No arguments. I smiled. You remember the last time I was on a plane? He nodded. You said you were scared of heights? I'm still scared, I said. But I've learned something. You can't fall if you finally decide to fly. He looked at me for a moment, then said quietly, That's exactly why we're going. We walked toward the gate. My suitcase wheels made that small, steady sound against the floor, a sound that felt like forward motion. I caught my reflection in the window. Older, yes, but lighter somehow. There was no trace of the woman who once sat alone at the back of a wedding, too afraid to meet her own eyes. I turned one last time to look at Denver, the skyline faint through the glass, the place that held both my pain and my redemption. For years, I had thought leaving meant losing, but now, it felt like closure. This time, I said softly, I'm not sitting at the back. Daniel heard me. He reached for my hand and held it, not tight, just enough to say you're not alone anymore. The boarding doors opened. We stepped forward together, the sound of footsteps blending with the announcement overhead. As we walked down the jet bridge, the air felt different. Lighter, like something had finally lifted off my chest. The hum of the plane grew louder, the scent of fuel mixing with coffee and new beginnings. We found our seats by the window. The city outside looked small now, all the noise and judgment and pain shrinking beneath the wings. Daniel settled in beside me, closing his eyes for a moment, calm as always. I looked out the window, watching the ground crew move in patterns I didn't understand. The captain's voice came over the speaker, calm and practiced. Prepare for departure. As the plane began to roll, I rested my head against the seat and whispered to myself, freedom doesn't come from winning. It comes from leaving with peace. The engines roared, the runway blurred, and the ground fell away. For the first time in years, I didn't feel fear, only weightlessness. And somewhere between the sky and everything I'd left behind, I realized I wasn't running anymore. I was finally going home to myself. They say justice means punishment. But for me, justice is being able to live peacefully in my own skin. 6 months later, Venice doesn't feel foreign anymore. It feels lived in, the rhythm of footsteps on cobblestone, the hum of water beneath bridges, the laughter of children echoing off the walls of old stone buildings. Life here moves slower, and that's what makes it beautiful. Every morning, I walk across the small courtyard of the Herald Foundation. It used to be an abandoned convent. Now it's a center filled with nurses, patients, and families who need rest as much as medicine. The air smells like fresh bread from the cafe next door, and the sound of boats outside mixes with the laughter of young volunteers. In one corner of the courtyard, there's a group of trainee nurses. I sit with them twice a week to teach English, simple phrases for care, comfort, and connection. They call me Signora Grace, and every time they do, I feel something in me heal just a little more. They remind me of who I used to be, the girl in a field hospital half a century ago, doing her best with trembling hands and borrowed hope. Sometimes, when I watch them, I think of the long road between that girl and this woman. It's strange how far you can travel without realizing you were heading home all along. Inside the main hall, sunlight hits the far wall where we hung Harold's photograph. He's smiling in it, not the polite smile he wore at business dinners, but the small, tired, gentle smile he had when he was finally at peace. Beneath the picture, a bronze plaque reads, "Founded by Grace Miller for those who stayed." Every time I walk past it, I stop and straighten the flowers beneath. Sometimes I talk to him under my breath, the way I used to when he was still in the hospital. "You see, Harold," I whisper, "they're staying. They're doing what you always hoped people would, showing up when it's hard." Daniel says the place has grown faster than we expected. Donations come in every week now. Volunteers arrive from all over, young doctors, retired nurses, even former patients who just want to help. I don't run things the way a manager would. I just keep people fed, listened to, and thanked. That seems to be enough. In the afternoons, when the sun begins to lower, I like to sit on the balcony overlooking the canal. From up there, you can see the children playing in the courtyard, their laughter carrying over the water like music. That's usually when Daniel appears with 2 cups of coffee. He doesn't ask if I want one anymore. He just sets it down beside me. "Busy day?" he asks. "They're good kids," I tell him. "They ask too many questions, but that's how you learn." He smiles. Reminds me of someone I know. We sit in silence after that. There's a kind of peace that doesn't need to be spoken out loud. The sun starts to sink behind the buildings, spilling gold across the water. It turns the whole city soft, like someone turned down the volume on the world. I think about everything that came before this. The funerals, the whispers, the trials, the headlines, the silence. All the times I was told to sit down, to stay quiet, to accept less. All the years I spent apologizing for taking up space. And now, here I am, sitting exactly where I want to be. The truth is, I don't feel like I won anything. There are no trophies for surviving what breaks you. But I did something better. I learned to stop shrinking just to make other people comfortable. Justice for me isn't revenge. It's breathing without guilt. It's laughter that doesn't ask for permission. It's walking through a crowd without wondering who's judging you. That's what peace really is. Not silence, but freedom inside the noise. Daniel turns toward me. "Thinking again?" he teases. "Always," I say, smiling. "But this time, it's good thoughts." He nods and leans back in his chair. "Then, let's keep it that way." The sky deepens, the sound of church bells rising faintly across the water. I look out at the horizon, the last light of the sun shimmering over the waves. For a long time I said yes to everything, even to things that hurt me, just to avoid being alone. Now I've learned that solitude isn't the same as loneliness. Sometimes it's the only place where you meet yourself again. I close my eyes for a moment, letting the warmth touch my face. Voiceover. For 50 years, I sat where they told me to sit. Today, I choose my own seat, and it faces the sun. The camera would hold there. A quiet woman in a wooden chair bathed in gold light, the sound of children laughing in the background. No drama left to resolve, no storms left to survive. Just peace, the kind you build with your own hands after the world stops watching.